You can go ahead and be turning to Psalm 91 if you would like. That's where we will begin here in just a little bit. Psalm 91. You know, it seems that we're living in a time, in a society where people are always tired. Always tired. In fact, it's been shown, and I know that we've spoke of it here, that when asked the question, how are you, that the most popular response is tired, rather than I'm okay, or I'm fine, or life is good, whatever, that the most popular response is I'm tired. And I know that as I look out at the audience today, I know that many of you are in the same position. I know that many of you are tired. I know that it's because for some of you, you have a lot on your plate. Maybe it's you're taking care of a loved one. Maybe it's you have so many responsibilities at work that it's wearing you down. Maybe it's that you have children going in every which direction and it seems that you're staying busy trying to keep up with all the different things that your kids are doing. Whatever it is, I know that for so many of you that you are so tired. And it seems that you're tired all the time. I know Fortune magazine released an article stating that Americans work an average of 38 hours a week. And that Mexico actually leads the globe working an average of 43 hours a week. Now that doesn't sound like a whole lot to some of you. But when you factor in the fact that that includes all people also that are working part-time, includes people that barely work at all, when you factor all of those people in, along with those who work full-time, and you still come up with nearly 40 hours a week, that's a lot of hours. That's a lot of people in the United States that are working an awful lot. You know, studies actually have shown that Americans take the least amount of vacation days of any nation on the globe. It's been said that Americans, that we are the most overworked, developed nation in the entire world. We're tired. And as I said, we're going to be looking at Psalm 91 today. You know that Psalm 90 is said to be written by Moses. We don't really know exactly who wrote Psalm 91. There are a couple of theories. The most popular are that Moses wrote it or David wrote it. Now, if Moses wrote Psalm 91, it would be pretty fitting to me because Moses knew a thing or two about being tired. You know what I mean? He definitely knew what it was to be exhausted. Can you imagine being in charge of leading a conservative estimate 2.5 to 3 million people through the wilderness trying to reach the promised land? 2.5 conservative estimate, 2.5 to 3 million people that you're trying to lead nearly on your own at times through the wilderness. And we don't have to wonder whether or not Moses was tired because often Moses would complain to God and complain to him about how hard it was to lead this group of obstinate people sometimes. But if it were written by David, I think that would also be very fitting as well, because David knew what it was like to be tired, be exhausted in doing the Lord's work. You know, we so often find ourselves in positions where we're trying to balance things. We're trying to balance what we have going on with the kids, what we have going on with other family members, and we're trying to balance our jobs in with all of that, and then we're trying to get to church, and we're trying to make sure that we're setting aside time for Bible study and prayer time, and we just have all of these things that we're involved in, and we try to balance them all, and it just doesn't seem to work. Because we have our hands full, and our plates are so full that we just can't really seem to get it all down and to balance it all. I believe it's in times like these when we're really exhausted, when we're overworked, when we're tired, that we really can appreciate the diversity of the Psalms. I know that we looked at a Psalm here about 3 weeks ago. I preached and we looked at Psalm 15 and we answered the question that is presented by David there. God, who may abide in your tent and who may dwell on your holy hill? And that was a psalm of didactic nature. That is a psalm that is teaching us something. But we also talked about how the psalms serve a lot of different purposes, about how there are those psalms of didactic nature that is specifically for teaching about God or how to live for God. And we talked about how there are also those Psalms of thanksgiving where the psalmist is literally doing nothing more than thanking God for His goodness and thanking God for what they've done. We've talked about how there are also Psalms of praise and worship where the psalmist is literally just wanting to tell God how good He is and praise Him. There are so many different types of Psalms that are serve so many different purposes. There were Psalms of ascent that the Israelites would sing as they were ascending on Mount Zion to worship God. So many Psalms serve so many different purposes. And what I'm hoping is that this morning, that this Psalm 91 will serve a very special purpose to you and I as well. That if you're one of those people that I'm talking about, and that you're tired, if you're weary, if you've got your plate full, you've got a lot going on, we can rest in His shelter and in His shadow. There's some things we're gonna talk about letting God. That's going to be the preliminary theme. Really, is let God do this, let God do that. Now, you've probably heard the phrase "let go and let God" before. If you haven't, you have now. It's a pretty popular phrase. Let go and let God, and that's in essence what we're talking about today. Because you see where we go wrong when we're overwhelmed and when we're stressed, when we have a lot going on, is we try to take it on ourselves and we try to solve problems and we try to get ourselves out of messes. But really, we need to let go and let God. In His shelter and shadow, number one, we have to let God be your refuge. Verses 1 to 4. I'm hoping that you're there in Psalm 91. You know, we see in the opening stanza of Psalm 91 that God will be your shelter in the time of storms. Did you know that 41 times in the book of Psalms, the psalmist refers to this idea of letting God be your refuge? 41 times in the book of Psalms. One of my favorite Old Testament passages is in Nahum chapter 1 and verse 7. It says, "For the Lord is a good God, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and He knows those who take refuge in Him." Some encouragement there. You know, this refuge of God is described in three ways here in Psalm 91. First of all, it's described as being trustworthy. You can trust that the refuge of God is available, and you can trust that the refuge of God is going to hold up. Verses 1 and 2, let's read that together. It says, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust." You know, the psalmist is really trying to paint a very beautiful picture here. Here's the picture that the psalmist is trying to paint. It's the idea of a soldier who is in battle. And if you as a soldier stay where you're at right now, you're going to be captured. That you're going to be taken. But if you will ascend upon the hill that is behind you, and that if you will take refuge in the rock, that you will be safe. The rock, of course, meaning God. The idea that the psalmist is saying is that you have to take refuge in God and that you will be safe from harm from your adversaries. The idea of trusting in God is a recurring theme in the Bible. Over and over, Old Testament, New Testament alike, it talks about what it means to trust in God, to place your trust in Him. And the psalmist is saying you can trust in the refuge that God supplies. Secondly, the refuge of God is delivering in verse 3. It says, "For it is He who delivers you from the snare of the trapper and from the deadly pestilence." You notice that phrase, from the snare of the trapper and from the deadly pestilence. When you think about what it means to snare something, the psalmist is saying that there are going to be adversaries, that there are going to be foes who are going to try to snatch you up, who are going to try to snare you. And oftentimes the adversary comes in the form of being busy. Oftentimes the foe comes in the form of being so tired. And that there are going to be things in life that try to snare you, that try to snatch you up, that try to cause you to stumble in your relationship with God. but God is your deliverer. There's always an adversary. There's a war going on for you right now. You know, this reminds me of James chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, which says, "Submit therefore to God. Flee the devil and he will flee from you. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you." The idea that if you draw near to God and that if you take refuge in the arms of God, isn't that a beautiful picture in your mind when you think about what it means to be safe in the arms of God? I can remember being a little kid, and I'm sure some of you are in the same boat as I am. I can remember being a little kid, and sometimes I would sneak off into my room and I would watch some kind of scary movie or something that I wasn't supposed to watch. Mom and Dad said, "Don't be watching that stuff." And some of those scary movies would absolutely scare me to death. And guess where I wanted to be after watching it? I wanted to be with my parents. I wanted my mom to hold me. I wanted to sleep with them in their bed because I was scared to death. And when you're a kid and you want to run into the arms of your parents and you want to sleep with your parents, why do you do that? Well, because that's where you feel the safest. You feel safe in the arms of your parents. And keep that picture in mind. That's really, in essence, what we're talking about. That's the picture I want you to keep in mind, is this idea that God is standing there with His arms spread wide and He wants you to take refuge in His arms, because that is the safest place that you and I can be. The refuge of God is delivers you from whatever it is that you're experiencing. Thirdly, understand that the refuge of God is covering, according to verse 4. It says He will cover you with His pinions, and under His wings you may seek refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and bulwark. Now again, there's a couple of other things that are being pictured here that I want you to understand. And I'd love it if you could go back and if you could study this the way that I've been privileged to study it and see some of the original Hebrew and in essence what the psalmist is really trying to say, because that's what I'm hoping to share with you today. But there are really two schools of thought that he's trying to mention here. The first one, the picture, is the idea of a mother hen. And the idea that this mother hen is protecting under her wings her chicks. And that if you're going to get to the chicks, the babies, that you have to go through the mother. And the idea is that no matter how hard you try, you just will not get through the mother to get to her chicks. And it's portraying God in that very same way. And there's also another thought, another picture that's being painted. It's that of a soldier. It's that of an Israelite soldier that's in battle, and he's carrying with him this large shield. This shield that is supposed to protect him from his adversaries and protect him from their attacks. Think about, again, the idea of God taking you under His wing and the idea of Him covering you. We have to let God be our refuge. So when you're struggling and when you're tired, when you're weary, when there's things going on, understand that you can take refuge in God, knowing that in Him you can trust that He will always hold up His end of the deal. And also understanding that His refuge in His arms, that you will be delivered, and also that God will cover you. Let God be your refuge. Secondly, number 2, let God be your power. Your power, verses 5 through 10. We have to let God be our power over a couple of things, really, that we're going to talk about. But God is really supposed to be your power over everything, so much more than we're going to mention today. But we're going to highlight a couple of things that the psalmist, I believe, is trying to explain here. We have to let God be our power over, number 1, over fear. Verses 5 and 6, it says, "You will not be afraid of the terror by night, or of the arrow that flies by day, of the pestilence that stalks in darkness, or of the destruction that lays waste at noon." I have a question. What is it that you dread? What is it that you fear? I know that so many of you have different fears. We're afraid of different things. Maybe you're not afraid of what the psalmist is saying here. Maybe you're not afraid of the terror that comes by night. Maybe you're not afraid of the arrows that fly by day, but I know that there's something that you're afraid of. We're all afraid of something. Maybe it's taxes. Maybe you're afraid of taxes. I don't know. Maybe you fear that next doctor's appointment and what the doctor's going to say. Maybe you fear some sort of responsibility that you have at your job that you know you have to get taken care of, and that if you don't do it, that no one else will, and you're afraid that you're just not going to get it done in time. What is it that you're afraid of? You know, I heard a story, and it's believed to be a true story, actually, of this guy who is getting ready to move into a new city. And as he steps off the plane at the airport, he calls a cab, and he gets into this cab. And this is a new city to this guy. He's never been here, and he has so many questions about the city. And as the cab driver leaves the airport, they don't get very far before the passenger, and his curiosity sets in, and he wants to ask the cab driver some questions. He wants to ask this local some questions about the city, and so he decides to reach up and to tap the cab driver on the shoulder. Well, upon reaching up and tapping the cab driver on the shoulder, the cab driver screams bloody murder, nearly swerving into oncoming traffic, before finally getting over on the side of the road and coming to a complete stop. The passenger in the back is saying, "What in the world? I am so sorry. I did not mean to scare you like that." The taxi driver replies, "You scared the living daylights out of me." The passenger says, "I am so sorry, sir. I had no idea that just tapping you on the shoulder would scare you like that." And the cab driver thinks about it in a moment, and he says, No, it's okay. It's really my fault. You see, this is my first day driving a cab. For the past 25 years, I've been driving a hearse. You know, there are things that we're afraid of. Things that scare us to death. Things that we dread. Things that weigh us down. But you know, in all reality, we have no reason to fear anything at all. No reason to fear anything. You know, the Apostle Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7, "For God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline." You see, God created you not to be a fearful being or a timid being, but a being who is fearless. Now, when I say fearless, when it comes to the idea of being a fearless person, why are we able to be fearless? Well, that's because we know that the God we serve is capable of all things. And in that, it's not that we have courage in ourselves or faith in ourselves, but we have courage in a God who is able to do all things and a God who wants to be our power. Let God be your power over fear. Secondly, we have to let God be our power over defeat. Defeat, verses 7 through 10. In verse 7 it says, 1,000 may fall at your side and 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not approach you. That is the things that he's just got through mentioning in verses 5 and 6. You will only look on with your eyes and see the recompense of the wicked. For you have made the Lord my refuge, even the Most High, your dwelling place. No evil will befall you, nor will any plague come near your tent. Let God be your power over defeat. You know, it's so easy when we're exhausted to feel like we're defeated. Have you ever gotten to that point in life where you just feel defeated? Where you're so tired and you're just so sick of the way things are going that you want to go to bed and lay there and lay there and lay there, and you never want to get up because you feel so tired, because you feel defeated. You know, there was a man by the name of George Bernal who owned the Livermore Power and Light Company. In 1901, George donated an improved incandescent light bulb to the Livermore Fire Department. Again, this was in 1901. Now, 119 years later, believe it or not, that same bulb that is hanging from the same wiring structure that it was that was original is still shining there in Livermore at the fire department. Isn't that amazing? It has been burning nonstop for 119 years. 119 years. Can you imagine that sort of power in a light bulb? It's been, the bulb that is, has been honored by presidents, by members of Congress, senators. It's been acknowledged by the Guinness Book of World Records as well as Ripley's Believe It or Not. This is a pretty famous light bulb. But actually, this light bulb has its own website. You can go check it out. 119 years this light bulb has been burning. Can you imagine the kind of power it takes to accomplish something like that? I say that because I want to put a picture in your mind of the God that you serve. That though that bulb is really powerful and really something to behold, that the God that you serve is so much more powerful than that. It's so much more powerful than anything your mind could fathom. God's more powerful than whatever it is that you're dealing with, than that situation, and you don't really see a way out. You see that your only options are lose-lose type situations. That the God you serve is more powerful. The psalmist is saying to you right now, in this psalm, the idea is that because you serve such an everlasting and all-powerful God, that you can trust that He will be your power over fear and that He will be your power over defeat. Christian, this morning, I want you to know that yours is the victory. I want you to know that if you put your trust in God, that regardless of what happens to you, that at the end of life, that you will have this crown of life that God says He will reward you. You always have victory when you put your faith in God. Let God be your power. Let God be your refuge. Number 3, let God be your assistance. Verses 11 through 13. It says, "For He will give His angels charge concerning you, to guard you in all your ways. They will bear you up in their hands, that you do not strike your foot against a stone. You will tread upon the lion and the cobra, the young lion and the serpent. You will trample down." Let God be your assistance. You know, here a few days ago, it's been several days ago now, I sure thought I could use some assistance. My cousin and I, we were fishing on the lake here, on Lake Eufaula, and we were catching quite a few fish. I mean, the fishing was good. We woke up that morning, the wind was blowing 22 miles an hour, and we said, I don't care, we're going fishing anyway. Not thinking about the fact that the wind had been blowing for well over 20 miles an hour for a day and a half before that, the entire night leading up to that morning when we were going to be fishing. On the way in, boy, it was bad. It was choppy, but we made it. We pull up to one of my spots, the first spot. We're catching fish. We catch 5 or 6 fish in a span of maybe 5 minutes. Things are going well. And I decide, you know what? Let's turn around and go back across the lake. I have some other spots that are similar to this one, and I'm sure it'll be just as good. Well, this is probably, we'd fished several places, so I want to say an hour and a half later. We turn around and come back across the lake, and we can't do it. This 18-foot bass boat is literally incapable of getting across the lake. It's not happening. We keep going over these waves, and as we're going over, the boat goes almost straight up and down. The motor submerges in water, and we get out. We're in the middle of the lake, mind you. The motor dies about 15, 16 times. We don't have a motor, and so we're scared to death. We're thinking we're about to be stranded out here in the middle of the lake, nothing to do. And it's funny how in that moment I was thinking, I just saw an ad not too long ago about Towboat US on Lake Eufaula, and I decided that I didn't need that kind of assistance. But boy, in that moment I was sure thinking and wishing that I had become a member of Towboat US. And it's funny how we find ourselves in situations where we're thinking, wow, I sure could use some help. Let God be your assistance. And I want you to know that God really wants to come to your aid when you're in need. And in verses 11 through 13, you'll see the idea that God really does want to help you. Sometimes when we talk about God and His help, we talk about it as if God is at a distance and God is hesitant to help. And if we beg God for help and if we really, really try, then maybe God will help, maybe He won't. But that's not the picture that the psalmist is painting for us. The picture that he's painting is that God really wants to help you. He really wants to be your assistance. He really wants to be your aid. You'll also notice verses 11 through 13. You've heard this before. It appears in the temptation of Jesus in the New Testament. Satan uses Psalm 91 when he's tempting Jesus, saying, "For he will give his angels charge concerning you to guard you in all of your ways." He says, just throw yourself off this cliff, for God said that the angels would be in charge of you, that they would take care of you. And you know Jesus' response. He quotes Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 16 about how we are not to put the Lord our God to the test. I think we're guilty of that sometimes. I think we put the Lord our God to the test. We say things like, "God, if you're really there and if you really want to help me, then you'll help me right now." You know, when we try to put God to the test, we're actually sending a message that we don't trust Him at all. It says in verse 13, "You will tread upon the lion and cobra. The young lion and serpent will trample down." How many of you are scared of snakes? I want to see a show of hands on this one. How many of you? Oh, yeah. That's what I thought. So many of us. Oh, yeah. Andy said, "I'm scared too." So many of us are scared of snakes, right? I'm not really scared of snakes. I'm scared of spiders. And some people tell me that that doesn't make any sense, that a snake is so much scarier than a spider. But think about this. I can see that snake. Okay? Sometimes that spider gets up in your stuff, in your pillow, or someplace you can't see it. And such a little thing, all it has to do is bite you. And it's over for you. Okay? Not really, but that's the way I think about it in my mind. Okay? Probably not really over for me, but it might as well be if one bites me. Scared to death of spiders. There's a lot of things that we're scared of. I was watching a video on Facebook the other day of a small child who fell into a lion's pen at a zoo someplace. And how they were hurrying, trying to hurry up and get in there and get the kid out before the lion hurt him, and they were successful. But I can imagine in that moment and then after that family's probably scared to death of lions if they weren't already. And it's funny that the psalmist mentions both of those things. And I say all of that to say this. What the psalmist is really saying is that regardless of what it is that you're scared of, okay, that you will be helped, that you do not have any reason to fear whatever it is that you fear. Spiritually speaking, of course. You remember Psalm 23, one of the more popular verses in all of the Bible, or set of verses in all of the Bible. It says, "For I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Let God be your assistance. Quit trusting in yourself to get things done and let God aid you. Number 4, let God be your deliverer. Now, we've hit on this just a touch, but I want to dive in a little bit deeper. Let God be your deliverer. Let's read together verses 14 through 16. It says, "Because he has loved me, therefore I will deliver him. I will set him securely on high, because he has known my name. He will call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him. With a long life I will satisfy him and let him see my salvation." Let God be your deliverer. You know, we've been talking this whole sermon about let God be your assistance. Let God take care of it. Turn to God. Let Him be the one that takes care of your situation. But in all reality, I've said all that I've said up to this point, hoping that you'll take it to heart. But I've said all that I've said up to this point to make these next few points. When it comes to God being your deliverer, we need to understand first that our deliverance is conditional. Our deliverance is conditional. If you don't believe me, look in verse 14. Again, God speaking His response. It says, "Because he has loved me, therefore I will deliver him. I will set him securely on high, because he has known my name." So God's deliverance is dependent upon and hinged around the idea of whether or not we choose to love God. We want God to be our aid. We want God to be our assistance. We want God to be our power over all that we fear. But if any of that is going to happen, we have to understand that our deliverance is conditional. God says He will deliver us if we what? Verse 14, if we love Him. If we are faithful to Him. Notice also the conditional nature of salvation in other places of the Bible. I think of Noah and his family. Noah and his family was saved. Why? Because of the obedience and the faithfulness of Noah. And it was only because Noah was faithful that God delivered Noah and his family. Remember the Passover and how the angel of death swept through the land of Egypt and it killed all of the firstborn. Well, why were the Israelites able to be saved? Well, they were only saved. Again, it was conditional. They were only saved if they followed the instructions that were laid out for them by God. And if they took the blood of the lamb and they put it on their doorpost, only then did the angel of death pass over their house. Their salvation was conditional. I think of perhaps the conditional nature of the taking of Jericho over in Joshua chapter 6 and verse 2, where God says that He had already delivered Jericho into their hand, but only if they would carry out and follow the instructions that He laid out for them. Do you understand what I'm saying? We want God to be our power. Boy, I want that. We want God to be our assistance. We want God to be our refuge, and He is going to be. But our deliverance is conditional. You and I have to do our part. Maybe you like this illustration, maybe you don't, but one of my very favorite movies, probably my favorite movie and my favorite book of all time, is Where the Red Fern Grows. I've coon hunted almost all of my life, and when I was a kid, I loved it. I had some really good dogs. My dad took care of me, and he took me, I bet 5 or 6 nights a week, even during school. I loved it. I was eat up with it, and I loved Where the Red Fern Grows. And I'll never forget reading about how he had to save up. Billy had to save up for 2 years before he was able to buy his first dog. 2 years he worked every odd job that he could find, and he saved up and he saved up and he saved up to get to the point where he could buy a dog, and his first 2 dogs. And I remember a conversation that he had with his grandpa before that. Before he started saving money, he said, "Grandpa, I've been praying to God, and I have been asking for dogs as long as I can remember, and nothing's happened yet. Grandpa, I love God. I've been praying to Him forever, for as long as I can remember, and God still hasn't given me dogs." And what his grandpa says was very interesting to me. He says, "It could be because you're not doing your fair share." He said, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "Well, if you want God to help you, you've got to meet Him halfway." He says, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "If you do the work, you put in the time, you save up money, that God will give you the heart, that God will continue to give you the determination, and all that it takes to do your part." And I've always found that very interesting. I think we're oftentimes in the same situation as Billy was in. We're sitting around scratching our head and we've said, "God, I've been asking you for help as long as I can remember. God, I've been asking you for counsel. God, I've been asking you for guidance as long as I can remember, and you won't answer me. God, it seemed like you've turned your back on me. I thought you wanted to help me." Well, it could be, if you're in that situation, that you're not doing your fair share. It could be that there's no real relationship between you and God at all, and you wonder why God isn't stepping in. Maybe God really is answering. Maybe God really is doing your part. Because sometimes, whether we like it or not, the answer to our prayer is not always what we hope it's going to be. Sometimes the answer is no. But that's really not the point. God, I'm reminded of the Old Testament. God promised the Israelites that if they would put their trust in Him, that if they would be faithful to Him, that if they would keep His commandments, that He would be their God, that He would be their protector, and that He would make sure nothing bad happened to them. As far as letting their enemies come in, He wouldn't let it happen. And what happened? The moment that the Israelites turned away from God and they were disobedient, and they stopped walking in the commandments, God was forced to withdraw His protection from them, and they were overtaken. They were taken into captivity. When it comes to letting God be your deliverer, when it comes to letting God be your power and your refuge and your assistance, we have to do our part. Our deliverance is conditional. Do you love God? Are you living a life of faithfulness to Him right now? I hope so. We also need to understand that our deliverance is certain. I don't want you to be thinking about the idea of deliverance being conditional and let it take away from the fact that our deliverance is certain if we're faithful to God. It's not one of those things, if you're faithful to God, maybe He'll help you when you need Him and maybe He won't. If you're faithful to God, God says, I am going to help you. I want to be your assistance. I want to be your power. I want you to notice all of the I will statements that's made in this psalm, in Psalm 91. I mean, just read, just in these 16 verses, the I will or the you will statements. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my God, in whom I trust, for it is He who delivers you from the snare of the trapper and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you, in verse 4. In verse 5, you will not be afraid of the terror by night. In verse 8, you will only look on with your eyes and see the recompense of the wicked, for you have made the Lord my refuge, even the Most High your dwelling place. No evil will befall you, nor will any plague come near your tent. Verse 11, for He will give His angels charge concerning you. They will bear you up in their hands. Verse 13 says, you will tread upon the lion and cobra, the young lion and the serpent you will trample down. Because He has loved me, therefore I will deliver him, says God in verse 14. I will set him securely on high, again, verse 14. Verse 15, He will call upon me and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble, verse 15. I will rescue him and honor him, verse 15. With long life, I will satisfy him and let him see my salvation. Are you getting the point here? Over and over and over and over again. I will. Does God keep His promises? Yes, He does. Just in these 16 verses, over and over again, God is making a point. I will. Folks, we have to trust that God will. That He will see to it. Stop doubting that God will help. Though our deliverance is conditional, and though we have to be faithful and love God and trust Him, if we will do that, our deliverance is certain. Third and finally, understand that our deliverance is satisfying. That which is able to satisfy. In verses 15 and 16. It says, He will call upon me and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him. With a long life I will satisfy him and let him see my salvation. You know, He speaks of long life and He speaks of salvation, but in all seriousness, the emphasis is really on the satisfaction that comes from the salvation of God. It's really where the emphasis is. I know we're tired. Goodness knows that I know some of you have a lot on your plate. And sometimes it seems like it's just too much. And you're stressed out. And you're worried. You dread things. You're scared of what's going to happen. All of my life, I've heard people tell me, when I ask, well, what happens in this situation? You just have to turn to God. And to be honest, in those situations, I think that's kind of a cliche answer. And to be honest, I think that's not a satisfactory answer. Though that is the obvious answer. When you're dealing with something, turn to God. That's the obvious answer. I want you to make this practical, okay? When it comes to turning to God, there are things that we have to understand. There are specifics involved. Let God be your refuge. In other words, when things happen, let God be the first person you go to. Take refuge in Him. Let God be your assistant, that which comes to your rescue, that comes to aid you. Let God be your power. And let God be your deliverer in His shelter and shadow. I hope that you've enjoyed Psalm 91 today. We want to help you. And as we've just got through talking about, all of those things are available to you. God will be your deliverer. God will be your power. And as we discussed, all of that is conditional. And so I ask, where are you today? Are you living a life of faithfulness? Do you love God with all of your heart? Are you doing everything in your power to please Him? If not, we want to help you with that. We want to get that taken care of and straightened out right now. If you're not a Christian yet and you would like to become a Christian, boy, we sure love getting to do that. If you want to obey the gospel and be immersed into Christ Jesus, your sins will be forgiven. The Lord will add you to His church. We want to help you with that as well. If we can pray for you, if we can pray with you, whatever your need, please come now as we stand.